Hello, dear viewer, and welcome to Interior Design with Andrew. Today we'll be talking about how you can add a little timeless modernity to any space in your home by thinking about each room as it was a translation error, so we're not going to do those room makeovers. I mean, okay, but you realize how much we spent on the Okay, well, it turns out we're still just writing with Andrew, so we won't be doing any interior design today. Or will we?
No, you won't. Production put a hard stop on that. Just talk about stanzas, bud. That's why we're here.
Yeah, but designing stanzas is a little bit like designing rooms, isn't it?
Whatever gets the video done by the deadline, sure, why not?
Great, well, actually, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves.
We?
Fine, me. Poems are probably most famous for being written in lines. It's what sets poetry apart from prose, after all. And the poetic line can be a tricky concept to wrap your head around. At least it was for me, until a visiting poet helped me to understand it by saying that every line should have integrity. And I'll link to a video about that insight at the end, so stick around for that if you want to know more about lines. But anyway, some poems, as you probably know, are written with just one line following the next. But others are broken up into groups of lines, and these groups of lines are called stanzas. Now, you might be tempted to call these paragraphs, and it is a fair comparison. Paragraphs are chunks of prose, and stanzas are chunks of poetry. Superficially, they seem to work in the same way. But paragraphs are made of sentences, and they run margin to margin. Stanzas are made of lines, and they have no necessary obligation to either margin. And now, does it really matter if you call a stanza a paragraph?
This is a show about writing, not non-proliferation treaties. Have we done anything that matters?
A fair question. And no, everything we do here is pretty low stakes. But there is a technical difference between a paragraph and a stanza, and you might just inflict some momentary distress on a poet if they catch you calling a stanza a paragraph.
So do your part by calling stanzas paragraphs today.
Traditionally, stanzas, like lines, were often structured by certain formal rules. So, in the same way that a line of iambic pentameter is composed of 5 pairs of unstressed and stressed syllables, a ballad stanza consists of 4 lines of alternating iambic tetrameter and trimeter, and the second and fourth lines rhyme at the end. Or take heroic couplets, which consist of paired lines of rhyming iambic pentameter, or sapphic stanzas, which are built something like this, or terza-rima, which looks something like this. But always, we want to think of our writing as more than just a template to be filled in. You can follow all the technical rules of a stanza form and still end up with something that just isn't worth reading. It's not the rhymes or the iambs that make it poetry. It's the lyricism, the poetic insight, the aesthetic judgment. And besides that, nobody's writing set forms anymore, so thinking of stanzas in terms of formal structures isn't that helpful anyway. What is helpful, though, is thinking about stanzas, dare I say, more rhetorically.
And there it is. Try not to mention rhetoric. Difficulty? Impossible.
Hey, there's lots of shows that don't talk about rhetoric.
I know, and people watch those ones.
Oh, lighten up. What I mean by that is that when we stop thinking of stanzas as set structures, we can start to think of them as tools for making meaning. And in that light, turning to the meaning of the Italian word stanza can give us some guidance. It means room, like room in a house room, thus our earlier misunderstanding. But think of it like this. There are certain objects that belong in the kitchen, certain things that belong in a bedroom, and certain things that belong in an office. In a perfect world, everything that goes in a kitchen both belongs in the kitchen and goes with everything else that's also in that room. And the same could be said of everything in a bedroom or some other room. Much like how I learned that poetic lines should have integrity, there should be a reason that you're putting things together in a certain room or stanza, or for why you're separating them. For example, here are a few lines from a poem I started drafting the other day. "Listen," he said, gesturing to the expanse of white that carpeted the ground and reached over our heads to filter, soften the cold afternoon sun. Surrounded by dark trunks, snow-swept peaks, I listened and heard nothing give way to the rush of life streaming behind my eardrum. There's no need to question this arrangement of lines. It works fine as it is, line after line in unbroken sequence. But there are opportunities to try other things, to arrange these lines in different rooms, so to speak, in order to achieve various different effects. In fact, as this first draft is written in my notebook, I split the stanzas here. And you can see maybe 2 initial rationales for dividing them this way. 1, the stanza break follows the structure of the sentence. The sentence ends and a new stanza begins. But second, these two stanzas are organized by perspective. The first focuses on an unnamed he who speaks and gestures at the landscape. The second focuses on the speaker and their immediate experience of the silence on the side of a mountain in winter. This is probably the equivalent of putting the blender and toaster and peppermill in the kitchen and the printer and swivel chair in the office. Grammatically and in terms of content, these stanzas break really naturally right here. It's clear why the lines in each room go in that room. But what if we did this? Here it's arranged in couplets. What effect does that have? And I want to be quick to say that there isn't an ultimately correct answer to that question. There is no objective dictionary of stanza shapes wherein all poems written in couplets mean one particular thing. But I might think this stanza arrangement does a couple of things in this case. For one, the rest of the poem makes it clear that this is a snowshoeing trip, and maybe the couplets could work to portion out tiny bits of information to the reader a step at a time. Maybe it's kind of like enacting on the page the step-by-step progression of snowshoeing. Or the couplets could emphasize the fact that there are two people in this poem alone in the snowy woods. The lines are grouped in twos, just like the people in the poem are. And again, that doesn't mean that couplets mean either of those things, just that if I were to make the choice to write the poem in couplets, there could be a reasonable justification for that choice. Remember, readers are wily and unpredictable creatures. Whenever you make a choice, readers are going to try to understand why you made that choice. So, if it ever came down to it, you'd want to be ready with an excuse that sounds smart enough to satisfy them. But check this out. Sometimes how you group things is less interesting than how you split them up. So what if we broke up the last few lines into two tercets, or sets of three? Here, of course, we have some reasonable conceptual grouping, the external experience in the first stanza and the internal experience on the second. But this break also lets us have some mischievous fun with how our reader reads. At first glance, it might seem like the speaker is saying they listened and heard nothing at all. And then the gap between stanzas only amplifies that reading. But then, when the sentence continues in the next stanza and supplies the rest of the sentence, it forces the reader to reassess the structure of the sentence as well as their understanding of the experience being described. So for that split second, the reader experiences hearing nothing. It lingers across the stanza break. And then, like it was for the speaker, nothing gives way to another, unexpected acoustic experience. Breaking the stanzas here could amplify the drama of the absolute silence of the woods, slowly giving way to the rush of blood circulating in the speaker's ear. Of course, there's no rule that you have to make all your stanzas the same size either. We could just as easily do something like this. Again, we get some yawning white space after expanse. It's a fun little dramatic moment, if not a little on the nose. That third stanza now seems to be held together by a lot of S sounds that I hadn't even noticed until they were all smashed together, and then we get two concluding couplets that could serve to slow down the pace and draw out the final revelation of the scene. And there's 100 different things you could do. We haven't even touched on the lines themselves.
Nor will we. We can only hemorrhage so many views a week, you know.
Okay, fine. The short version is this. When you're writing prose, you can shape meaning with word choice, sentence structure, and paragraph structure. Poets usually give up paragraphs in order to pick up the tools of lines and stanzas, which are two additional ways to group and separate units of language in order to influence or shape the way a reader experiences the text. But the further we get from individual words, the less fixed meaning gets. We all know what the word artichoke means, but the meaning of rhyming couplets or of a 6-line stanza is really context sensitive, and even then it's hard to pin down. So you might think of your line and stanza choices as giving impressions or steering your readers in a certain direction based on how you organize your thoughts, instead of absolutely giving your readers a clear, decipherable meaning. So, for example, if your poem absolutely hinges on your reader's understanding that your 3-line stanzas mean the first 3 seasons of the year, and that the missing 4th line is symbolic somehow of how empty your life was during the first winter after your goldfish died, the actual symbolic meaning of stanza structure is just too loose to communicate that reliably. You might want to, I don't know, maybe also give your readers some literal clues that that's what the poem is about. 3-line stanzas meaning a sad winter is something that you made up, not something that a reader could reasonably be expected to come up with on their own. But by all means, play with context, play with arrangements, and play with how you shape the reader experience. But think of these structural elements as complements to the meanings of words, rather than replacements for them. What the poem actually says is almost always going to speak louder than what it doesn't say or what shape it says it in.
But what about that one?
I know, it's impossible to say anything about anything on the internet without someone bringing up a fringe counterexample. Sure, there may be a poem or two or even 100 that make incredible use of meanings implied by subtle stanza structures, but the overwhelming majority of poems just don't. So why make things harder for yourself and your reader than you need to? To say that something is a general best practice, of course, is not to issue a statement that applies to all cases. That's why it's a best practice and not an axiom. But hey, as they say, you can't break poetry. It's a genre big enough for whatever you want to do. Hopefully, though, this little tour of stanzas gave you an idea of what's possible to help you get started on your own experiments. As we finish, thanks for being here today, and be sure to check out the end screen for a video on lines and for the rest of the playlist on poetic forms. There's lots of stuff to keep you busy until we meet again in the next one.